So welcome to our third industry webinar on the horticulture sector. We look forward to these. DPI and our ALEC team is an opportunity to connect planning and local government professionals with agricultural professionals from DPI and across the industry itself. It's been very enjoyable, and it's something which has been prompted from our discussions with councils. There was a lot of interest in getting this kind of content and understanding of different industries. So we'll begin with an acknowledgement of country. The Department of Regional New South Wales acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and we show our respect for elders past, present and emerging. We're committed to providing places in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally and economically through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. There's always a bit of housekeeping first. So the sessions are going to be recorded, so stay on mute if you will, and turn your camera off if you don't want to be filmed. We are, however, very keen to take your questions and your comments. So the best way to do that would be to post in the chat or else on the ideas wall of our Paddock to Planning website. The link for that's in the chat too. We're going to attempt to get to your questions at the end of the session. Otherwise, we'll follow up with the presenters later and get some responses for you. We'll begin with just a quick quiz to see why people have attended today. So for a range of answers, it's a good way for us to get a sense of, what people's interests are.
We might just wrap the poll up there and I'll share the results. So looks like the majority of people are here today for some professional development, which is really good. It's one of the great things about these industry webinars. It's a great way, like Rollo was saying, to get some information on the different industries in your backyard and obviously land use conflict and how to better address that in this industry. So yeah,
Welcome good
to the webinar.
Thanks for that, everyone. So the structure of today, many of you would have attended our previous webinars on dairy and poultry. Today's topic's a bit more broad because it's horticulture, and we're going to be starting with an overview from Kevin Quinlan, the leader of Northern Horticulture and DPI, who's going to give us some insight into the breadth of the industry, as well as some tools for understanding it in your area. And after that, we're going to be focusing on macadamia production as an example of orchard horticulture. For that, we've got Andrew Leslie here, who's going to give us a bit of ins and outs of his life as a macadamia grower. And then we're going to have our Macadamia Development Officer, Jeremy Bright, explaining how DPI has worked with industry to respond to land use conflict and other issues. We're hoping that through this case study, you'll be able to draw some insight into orchard production in your own areas. And just FYI, we also intend to hold a session on other forms of horticulture production in the future because we're anticipating there'll be a bit of interest in that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kevin. And we might
thank you.
With that poll, another poll,
Yeah.
Sorry, but this one is, where do council staff see the importance of horticulture in their local economy?
So the results there, Kevin, there that most people think that it's high to moderate, the importance of horticulture to their economy, and that's certainly good to hear that that's where most people think that the industry sits. So Kevin will provide some further information on why that is so.
Very encouraging. Over to you, Kevin.
Cool, thank you very much. Great to be here. I'll just start giving a bit of a run through about horticulture in general, a bit of an overview, and then we move to the other bits. The first bit I'll say is that what defines horticulture versus cropping is that generally horticulture is a branch of agriculture concerned with growing plants that are used by people for food, medicinal purposes, and aesthetic gratification. It's usually on small areas, high value per unit area, and staff intensive. And it can be annual or perennial, as opposed to cropping, so wheat, and barley, oats, other crops, etc. There it's usually annual crops and typically on a very broad scale. If we click onto the first bit, so within horticulture, there's essentially three sections we would consider. Production horticulture, which is all your nuts, fruits, vegetables, specialty crops like mushrooms falls into there, wine grapes as well. And then you can have things like intensive horticulture, whereby you have protected cropping. So in this instance, you know, tomatoes or capsicums or something like that. If we click to the next bit, the other part that we look at is ornamental horticulture. So that's all your nurseries, so wholesale nursery stuff, turf production, and cut flowers. And then the third part, we'd look at horticulture, which DPI is not involved in, but many of you probably are, is amenity horticulture, which is all your parks, gardens, in your backyard, landscaping aspects as well. So we'll focus on the production and the ornamental section. If we look at the value of horticulture to New South Wales, horticulture is the 4th largest agricultural industry within New South Wales. It's valued at about $2.6 billion when you include the wine industry within it. Okay, so I've put the wine industry in there. Within this bit, wine is pulled out separately because of the significance of it. This is only at the farm gate level, as many crops have secondary processing steps, e.g. nuts and wine. The value of horticulture increases dramatically when that's involved as well. If we go to the next slide, please. If we look particularly at the major categories, so fruit constitutes about 38% of all of it. So that's all your oranges, mandarins, lemons, berries, raspberries, blackberries, a whole range of other crops come into that as well. Vegetables at 25%. So that's all tomatoes, cucumbers, onions, mushrooms. Then you look at nursery, cut flowers and turf. It's the one sector that the name quite clearly says what's involved in it. And then 13% is nuts. And the 2 predominant nuts in that is almonds and macadamias. If we click to the next one, break it down to some more smaller parts of those, that's the big summary part. Nurseries is actually the largest single part of horticulture within New South Wales. Then there's other vegetables, and it's classed as other vegetables because it's a high range of different things. So tomatoes, etc., everything falls into that. Oranges is very significant on its own within New South Wales, especially down in the southern parts of the state. You have other fruit, and then blueberries, rubus. If we click to the next one, looking at that, just a bit about what DPI does within it. Our kind of core areas for our horticulture unit are about connecting communities together. So that's within industries and between industries and within the local area that we work as well. We also want to focus upon increasing productivity and profitability of it, but doing it in a sustainable way. And when I say sustainable, I mean economic, social, and environmental, the old triple bottom line, because it's absolutely critical that we achieve all 3 things in balance. We click to the next bit. The orange ones are all the locations where DPI horticulture is located, and they just coincide with the significant production regions. So we move from the far north coast up at Wellingbar, down the coast to just north of the Sydney and into the Sydney Basin. We move out to the orange region, where there's a lot of cherries, wine production, stone fruit, palm fruit as well. And then we move down into the south, Wagga, out into Griffiths, so the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, and then out to Derton with a huge amount of citrus production. So we'll click over to the next one. There's huge amounts of sources of industry information out there. I'm just going to run through a few different ones that you can utilize if you want particular information, and trying to bring it back to what I would think is useful to you, particularly in your LGAs and being able to break down information. So if we click on to the first one, DPI has a section called Performance, Data and Insights, and then we'll say at the end, all the links will be available to these. So this is a collection of information that displays by region. So just looking at it, this is just, if you click onto this section, it's about regional output. The first bit you'll get is looking at state top priority industries. And on the right part of that, you've got a wheel that gives you the proportionate size of the different industries. And as you hover over them, it will reveal information about them. If we click onto the next one, what you can do is click by a particular area. So I've picked North Coast here. So you can see that berries, cattle, you know, and then we've got nurseries as well, macadamias, all quite significant industries. When you hover over it, which is the next bit, thanks, say for like berries, as you hover over berries, it'll tell you that within the North Coast region, $253 million worth of berries is produced on the North Coast, and that's 98% of the state's total output. So I suppose a point here is that horticulture is very regional specific. Berries is chasing a microclimate area for production that the North Coast suits very, very well. If we click to the next one, please. ABARES, so Australian Bureau of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry runs ABARES, and this is their Agricultural Resource and Economics division. Within theirs, they have a data section, and you can click to a section called About My Region, which will bring up the next bit of it. So what this is, and I've just filtered this, you'll see at the top right, About My Region, and this is a snapshot of the whole screen because there's a lot more data on it. We've just filtered it to the Richmond Tweed, so again, the North Coast. You'll see that macadamias nurseries are the second and third biggest industries, but when you combine them, they're a huge part of horticulture, and it makes horticulture the predominant agricultural industry of the North Coast. If we click onto the next bit, just down the bottom, in the employment sector, we've just highlighted there what are the horticultural industries. And so those horticultural industries constitute 42% of all the ag workforce within the North Coast region. However, when you look at the land use, which is in the centre down the bottom there, and you focus on horticulture, it only occupies 1% of all of the land within the region. So the point here is that horticulture is traditionally labour intensive on small scales with high values of production. This doesn't account for any of the flow-on effects and the value of the industry. So, for instance, within the macadamia industry within the North Coast, you know, there's a huge number of other businesses that support that industry, be it from fabricators making machinery in town, rural suppliers, tractors, machinery bits, and I know every macadamia grower has a Bunnings account as well. If we click on to the next one, there's UNE, so University of New England, and this was through a national project. They have mapped the whole heap of tree crops and their distributions across Australia. So if we click on this, every single dot there actually represents a spot where there's an industry, and it gives you the colour of them, gives you which industry they are. So you'll see that based on the selection of this area, it's got that there's about 40,000 hectares of macadamias within Australia in that area that's selected, and about 9,000 hectares of avocados. We can zoom in much closer on this to within an actual LGA, and it will give you the hectares of production under it. So in this case, I've picked the Lismore LGA, and you'll see that there's about 5,000 hectares of macadamias in there and about 120 hectares of avocados. So if we click to the next one, what you can actually do is you can even go further and you can drill down to an individual property. So in this case, I just picked a property there, and it tells you that there's 4 hectares of macadamias there. What you will note on this map is that most of the properties are in the red colour, which is all the macadamia farms, and that's, again, horticulture is usually quite industry intensive within a particular area because of the microclimate that's suitable. There are some avocado orchards as well around there. The other thing is that I think is quite powerful with this tool is that you can, if you've got a particular area where someone's looking at development or whatever, you can utilize this to see who the neighboring crops are around that property and if they show on the mapping. So if we click to the next one, so just in summary, Horticulture is the 4th largest ag industry within New South Wales. The crops that are produced are highly nutritious and very, very dense in their nutrients within them. And I think most people would agree they taste really good too. Relatively, the holdings within horticulture are small. Horticulture occupies less than 150,000 hectares, or 0.2% of all of the land in New South Wales, but it's the 4th largest ag industry. So that means that it has very, very high values for unit area. For example, the nursery industry is about $681 million from 1832 hectares. If you work that back, that's about $370,000 per hectare of gross income, and at least 50% of that will be spent on expenses for the production of it, be that labour, buying materials in. So there's significant flow-on effects through the economy. We normally have high staff per unit area, and those staff requirements are often seasonal and can be difficult to access. Okay, there will be some of these things too. Is that when a horticultural crop kicks off, is that other businesses will be developed off the side. So, for instance, when they developed the blueberry farms out at Tabulum, they needed about 1,000 people, seasonal workers, which meant that they had to work with someone to create a backpackers accommodation system to access it, which then meant then there was other businesses for food, etc., that created in that area. If we click on to the next one, has large, as I'm talking about, large flow on and economic and community benefits of dollars invested back into the economy. We click to the next point. So yeah, usually crops are regionally specific, and they're regionally specific because you're chasing microclimates, or you might be chasing a niche market that's close by. And horticultural crops are typically irrigated because of the production cycle that they're in, and the needing of water to be able to grow those fruits very, very rapidly in a short space of time. Horticulture can be either permanent, so which would be typically your trees and vines, or your annual cycles vegetables. Why is this important? So if you've got trees and vines around you, excuse me, should there be a significant event like a flooding part that happens that we saw on the North Coast, you know, you'll see trees die like macadamias have on the floodplains. That means it'll be like a 7-year turnaround for those growers to get productivity back up. Whereas annual crops like vegetables, you can be back in production within 6 to 12 months when you have adverse ones. Rightio. And often horticulture is close to major centres, which can end up with land conflict issues. And there's probably a part here is that what often happens is horticultural industries start, because of those large flow-on effects, you have the requirement for workforces, and you have centres built around those parts. And so that's the whole dynamic of creating that conflict that occurs. And that's, yeah, the last bit is that food security is absolutely critical. So when I was talking about nutrient dense and nutrient high, it's critical that we ensure the viability from our perspective of industries, because we need to ensure that people have those foods that come in the future, and being able to produce a lot of food off a small area to feed people will be increasingly critical in the future. So I will leave it there.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Very good introduction. While we just get ready to hand over to Andrew, we'll just chuck up another perhaps silly poll about where do macadamias come from, moving into that section. Would imagine most people would know this, but you never know.
Decided not to make it too easy, the poll, and ask where Brazil nuts come from. All right, let's share the results for that one. So yes, got 47 or 72% of people saying that they come from Australia.
Okay, so some people might be surprised. It is, in fact, my understanding is it's our only native export crop. Maybe Andrew or Jeremy will be able to clarify that. But anyway, we'll hand over to you now, Andrew.
Thanks, Milo. I'm a macadamia grower at Alstonville in northern New South Wales. My father and brother and myself, we look after 8 farms with 22,000 trees in total. We're unlucky enough to have 39 neighbours across those 8 farms. On the side, we do a value-add skincare range using macadamia oil as our hero ingredient. I'm on the board of the Australian Macadamia Society, which is the peak industry body in Australia. And I'm also on the board of Marquee Macadamias, who we process and market 40% of the Australian crop. Next slide. So just to give you an idea, there's about 39,000 hectares planted in Australia, ranging from Mackay, Rockhampton in the north, down to Nambucca in the south. It is a native product of Australia. It's been, the fossils have been dated back 60 million years. And just for those of interest, it's actually related, or it's in the same plant family as the Grevillea, the Waratah, the Banksia and the Protea. This just shows the farm gate price, and it's, as you can see, it fluctuates quite a bit from year to year. It fluctuates because Australia exports about 80% of what we produce in Australia, and so we're prone to what's happened in world markets. You know, be COVID, China lockdown for a year. We've got the war in Ukraine; it's affecting what we export to Europe. So you know, there's been logistical problems as well. So the farm gate price at the moment is down to just below $2, and that's below cost of production. So we will see a bit of a tick up next year. We have to, otherwise there'll be a lot of people exit the industry. This just shows the processing. Every grower is aligned to a processor in Australia. So we harvest, we deliver to the processor, they dry it down, and then in most cases they then go through and crack and sort. They value add through roasting, they pack it, and then they export the nut. The bowl just has the kernel. So Australia, just in the past year, it's generally about 50% is kernel, and then the other 50% is sold as nut and shell. This picture on the right just shows a nut that's been sawn. The Chinese market like the natural format where they can just pry it open and eat it in its natural state. Just the production cycle. So August, September is traditionally the flowering time, and then in October, November, December, we have the nuts set, and then in that December, January, February is where the oil accumulates in the nut. From March through to July is when we do all our harvesting of the nuts. Back in August, September, when the trees are flowering, we have native bee boxes there, so they help pollinate the crop, as do European honeybees. During that flowering stage, we engage insect monitors that come in and monitor the crop and advise us the timing of when to spray and what to spray using the softer chemistries that are available. So this is just a few of the flower diseases that we have. So the insect monitors will advise us on those. The next slide just shows a sprayer in the background, and in the foreground is an anemometer, which just measures the climatic conditions, being the wind speed and wind direction and so on, which is a really important tool. Just to track you with a mower, just maintenance during the year. It's just one of the harvesters we use. We just tip into field bins. It just shows just a truckload of nuts where we're about to take back to our dehusking facility, which is in the next slide. It's just the dehusking line. It just takes the outer husk off the nut before it's then delivered to the factory. And rats are a pretty major pest problem in our industry. Probably 3 or 4 years ago, across our 8 farms, I conservatively estimated we lost about $70,000 in income from rat damage. So it's a pretty major pest in the industry. And this just shows we put out the manures and organic matter, and we have a window just after the nuts have harvested where we have to put that out because there's withholding periods of 4 months after we put it out. So that just shows the production cycle. So the big challenges for us, obviously, the rising cost of production, being the cost of fuel, fertilizer, and the chemistries we put on. But the by far the biggest problem is urban encroachment, with just the sheer complaints that we get, and I'll go through some of those here. So spraying, we have to spray 5 to 6 times a year because we're a monoculture crop. Every time we turn the sprayers on, they're very noisy. We generally spray at night so that we have lesser impact on bees. And because of that, everyone's at home, everyone's in bed, it's quiet, there's no other noise to interrupt. So it's in neighbours' front of mind when you're going through. And having 39 neighbours, you got to get the breeze right. If there is a breeze, and you know, every time you fill a tank up, it's you know, thousands of dollars in that tank. So if the wind changes while you're in the middle of spraying, it does have an impact on you, and there's certainly a cost for us. When we put our manures on, awesome for soil biology. It's a waste product, so we get a lot of chicken and cow manures from the food lots and poultry farms. We also get the compost from the council depots. It's a really good product, but it smells, particularly the manures. And if we don't get rain for 2 months after we put out the chicken manures, it's you're very popular with all your neighbours and the community. The dehusking, when we harvest our nuts and we run them through the shed, it's a very noisy process, and we've got blowers going. So if you do encroach into the night on that, when we have turnover of neighbours, it's generally always an issue. So we have to deal with that. Rat control, it's pretty major for the industry. Particularly these newer varieties that have got thin shells and big kernel, the rats get through them pretty quickly. We get new neighbours move in. They like to let their place go, have more trees. They let the camphor laurels go, the lantana grow, and that's just a habitat for rats to breed up. So we have to strategically bait to try and minimise that. We get rats' nests in trees. I go and shoot them out of the trees. Every time I shoot, I've got 2 neighbours that have got horses. They get spooked. So I have to deal with those challenges as well. Runoff and bare soil. So as part of our orchard plan, we've got good drainage. As the trees get closer together, you get less grass. So we try and have a pruning program in place. But just the sheer rainfall we've been getting the last few years, we've had 2 major flood events. Last year we recorded just over 3.8 metres of rain, and in one night there last year we had 437 mil in 24 hours. So no matter what plans you've got in place, that we do have there is erosion issues there just by the climatic conditions, and it's a major issue. We've got to try and maintain all that ground cover to keep our nutrients and soil in place. So it's a challenge for us. And the last one is just a picture. We had Better Homes and Garden come onto the farm a few years ago, where I'm regularly hosting customers from overseas that buy nuts, whether they're from Meiji in Japan or Costco in America. So we constantly have people coming and looking at our orchard practices on our farm, and it's great to showcase it. So that's a little bit about the macadamia industry.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's excellent. For anyone, just keep adding questions for whether it's Andrew or Kevin or Jeremy into the chat, and we'll get to them soon. I'll now hand over to Jeremy, our Macadamia Development Officer, but we might just start with another quick poll. Is it standard in your practice to consider, when you're looking at a DA or a PP in an agricultural area, to consider agricultural practices? Imagine a lot of this is contextual, but I suppose part of what we're doing is trying to raise a bit more awareness of the intricacies of these sort of industry practices and get a bit more opportunity for thinking more broadly about impacts and future changes. So
we might just end the poll there, and I'll share the results. And it's good to see that well, the majority, 65% of those on board today, say that they always consider it. And hopefully today's information will help those others that don't typically use that or think that it possibly should be as well. So we'll hand this back to Jeremy.
Take it away, Jeremy.
Yeah, okay. I'm just coming in from the department point of view. My job is to industry development officer is to support macadamia growers, primarily in the state of New South Wales. I work for the New South Wales government, but macadamias don't stop at the border, so I do a lot of the articles and publications for all macadamia growers in Australia. So if we go to the next slide, we're looking at the presence of agriculture and non-rural properties side by side, and the generation of conflict because of the potential for incompatibility. Agriculture affects that small rural landholding, and which essentially is just for residential purposes. And similarly, the small rural landholdings will have an adverse influence on the continual operation of agricultural enterprises, which the Americans would call right to farm, which we call normal agricultural practices. So these issues where there's no separation between the two incompatibilities, there's misunderstandings. So this is pretty much what Andrew was talking about. I'll elaborate a bit more on that. So in the 30 years of horticulture that I have been through, from apples, cherries, mangoes up in the territory, you see this happening quite a bit. Can we go to the next slide? I'll spend all the time on that slide. So here's some of the issues that Andrew alluded to. Right there, you can see the tractor with the noise, the odour of the chook poo 4 months before we go into harvest, the chemical sprays, spraying itself, just the noise of a tractor starting up at night time. What are they doing? So whether it's educated or non-educated, there's complaints that way. The light in certain other industries. Visual pollution, particularly with amenities. For example, where we have hail netting in orange. The netting's not only there to protect from hail, but in blueberries, the netting's there also to protect from birds. So that visual pollution, I guess you could call it, according to the residential dwellers. And pest and disease and weed infestations also encroaching onto farm. We go to the next slide. So I think these conflicts, education's key to solutions. It's usually a lack of understanding as to why that grower is doing that spray, and educating those people as to the reasons for that and why the chook poo is going on. Educating for those reasons. Agriculture is dynamic and it's quite a complex system. And the operations of the farm will vary depending on what equipment will be involved and the cost possible misunderstandings there. So lifestylers want the views, but they don't want the associated noise and the odours. We'll go to the next slide. Sorry. So basically what we're looking for here is about 2015. The industry got together and we realised that the industry had issues with high density plantings. The orchard would canopy over. We'd lose the ground cover, and particularly in the northern rivers on steep slopes, we get high amounts of rainfall events, east coast lows, where you might get 300 mils overnight, and that washes a lot of that soil away. So historically, there's a bit of an environmental impact there, and obviously land use conflicts. So the industry got together and basically said, we need to do something about this, and implement some best management practices to prevent that erosion from happening. So basically working on a social license. Go to the next slide. So we developed and we got together with an investigative committee, a bunch of growers. We went up and down the east coast of Australia. We basically wanted to develop a consistent language, create that awareness further throughout the whole of industry. We needed to understand the issues, identify what the good growers did. There wasn't any silver bullet there, but it was attention to detail and to act quickly. Where there was ground cover being lost, the good grower would attend to that and create light to the orchard floor to get that ground cover back. Then we got their heads together. We used the 40, 50 odd years of macadamia research from DPI and Queensland Department of Ag and Fisheries, and also grower experiences, and we put together a publication. We go to the next slide. So the publication is Integrated Orchard Management. We shorten that to IOM. Everybody in the industry knows what IOM is now. And from that study group, we identified 3 pillars. First pillar being canopy management, so not allowing that orchard to canopy over and darken up the whole orchard floor. Next one was orchard floor, so maintaining that ground cover on your orchard floor, and the next one was drainage. Even though the pillars are equal, drainage is probably the critical one here. Basically, we're trying to control run onto the farm, run through the farm over grass waterways, and run out of the farm nice and clean. Go to the next slide. So from the study group, we identified these key red flags, which means you're going to be losing production. 5 out of these 8 red flags are created through drainage issues. So that's how important drainage was. We go to the next slide. So this is how we go about fixing up those solutions. A while back, there was LiDAR flowing across the state of New South Wales. LiDAR is free to get, but we do have a guy that can interpret that LiDAR very clearly for macadamia farms. So this is the final plan from a LiDAR. You can see the yellow lines here are watercourses. The top lines there are drainage diversion banks, and basically how we can alleviate the erosion on that farm. So LiDAR will measure height and interprets height and slope, and then we use the universal soil loss equation to estimate how much soil loss we would get in a typical year, tonnes per hectare. So if we go to the next slide, so this is 2 slides. First slide at the top is telling you this is an orchard with only 20% ground cover within the orchard, 95% ground cover outside the orchard. By using diversion banks, taking out trees, creating grass watercourses, we go down to the bottom slide. We've now created further ground cover on the moderate to steep slopes, 90 to 95% ground cover. So there's no better erosion control than having not good ground cover, living and non-living. So all growers now have access to LiDAR. We then ran an incentive program through the Clean Coastal Catchments program, which is run by Marine Estate Management to protect the runoff into the Pacific Ocean off Ballina and the New South Wales North Coast. This funding basically provided every grower with the soil loss equation and the LiDAR mapping, the length of slope, so a whole heap of maps then suggestions about how they could ameliorate the erosion. So there was $5,000 given to the growers to then act on that. So start to incorporate drainage networks. We found from that there was a multiplier of about 4 to 1, where once the growers did have the machinery on the farm, they used the $5,000, but then they said, well, we might as well fix up everything else because we've got the machinery here. So it really was a good bang for the buck for that project. However, it can't be done immediately. There's certain periods where you wouldn't want to be doing this when there's a short window of rainfall, heavy rainfall. You also can't do it while you're harvesting. So there's probably only a 3-month window where we can get action on ground. Next slide. So we go into another controversial issue is spraying. So basically we've had a IPM project or an IPDM project, Integrated Pest and Disease Management Project, incorporated into research for macadamias probably for the last 10 years. IPDM is looking at 3 strategies for pest control. It's looking at biological control, so releasing of predatory pests to take out the pest, or predatory insects to take out the pest. It's looking at cultural practices, so trying to open up orchards. And it's also, as a last resort, looking for chemical options. So it's based around good monitoring and informed decision making. IPM is a proactive system in that it sets up the thresholds, with the decision making being reactive when they hit that threshold. So once that threshold has been hit, it's an economic loss. If it gets any more, it'll be an economic loss to the grower, and they need to react. And they can't wait a week to react. They've actually got to react right there and then. So we go to the next slide. So we got crop protection. The crop protection starts really at flower initiation and goes right through to harvest. As Andrew said, 60 million years of macadamias. There's also been 60 million years of native pests developing with those macadamias. So industry basically has good IPDM. A while back, probably a decade ago, even longer, we developed the trichogramma wasp for biological controls. This wasp will hunt down the macadamia nut borer eggs, lay its young into those eggs, and we haven't had to spray for macadamia nut borer for the last 10 years. Basically, it controls that biological pest, beneficial controls macadamia nut borer. It also protects the mangroves down in Ballina. We had the mangrove guy in fisheries, Pat Dwyer, come up to us, say there's 300-year-old mangroves that are dying. The macadamia nut borer is native to those mangroves. It was killing them. We gave them the cards that released the wasp. Now those mangroves are surviving. We do cultural control. DPI recognised about 10 years ago, deep dark orchards, concrete over orchards, you get higher amounts of lace bug, which will take out all your flowers. You get higher amounts of fruit spotting bug, which will give you high levels of insect damage. You open up those orchards, you diminish that population. You still have to spray, but you get a lot less of that pest. And then we have chemical controls. So we're basically trying to look at softer options, more pest-specific options, but this could come back on us because then there may be more sprays required because we're only targeting a few pests rather than the broad spectrum. So we tend to try and combine chemical actives in the one spray so that we keep it down to 4 or 5 sprays. We spray at night time because we want to avoid the spray drift. We want to also avoid any residual pollinators that might be around. There's not just bees that are pollinators. There's other things like birds and whatever else, insects that pollinate as well. So we try to avoid that at night time. We'll go to the next one. So here's a good example of IPM working really, really well. This weevil is looking for a site to lay. It'll lay its egg under the husk, between the husk and the soft shell. The young one will hatch. It'll eat out the kernel. It'll come out another weevil. Once it does that laying, it'll chew off the nut. The nut will drop to the ground, and the young will hatch. So what the grower had to do was mulch up the fallen nut on the ground, which would be bashing the soil. Then he would have to spray a heavy duty chemistry to kill off that weevil. He'd have to do that 3 times a year, mulch, spray, mulch, spray, mulch, spray, because the weevil was continually coming in. We identified a product called indoxacarb, and that product will stop that weevil from laying. It won't kill it, it'll stop it from laying. So that gives us good protection right up from 8 mil nut size right through to harvest. So we've gone from 3 mulch sprays, bashing the soil, spraying 3 times, to 1 spray, and therefore environmental outcomes, everything is a good outcome from that. We go to the next slide. So yeah, land use conflicts. I guess the stray drift, perceived and real. I get called out by the AMS quite often to go visit growers who have had a spray drift issue. Basically, that's resulted in growers. We have funding through our Climate Smart program, where growers have been allowed to install weather stations. So in the past, we used to rely on Byron Bay, Lismore or Ballina, but they're nowhere reflective of the microclimates that are within the Northern Rivers region. So every grower now pretty much will have a weather station either in their farm or near their farm where they can rely on that data. So that weather data will go to their phone. It'll say, stop now, your sprays, the winds have gone too heavy, your spray's going towards your neighbour. So Andrew's got to sort of go out in the day and he says, okay, those houses to the west, there's a westerly wind blowing now, I can spray that side. I can't go to the easterly side now because the neighbours over there will get the drift. So it's not just a one-off operation. It's not just 4 neighbours, one on each side of the boundary. It's actually 30 plus neighbours that these guys have got to deal with. And remember what we said about IPDM. Once you do get to that threshold, you've got to spray now. You can't wait a week. In a week, lace bug will take out your whole orchard. So these are the sort of things growers have got to juggle with, but it's also the things that probably the residents have got to understand as well. We go to the next one, please. Okay, so other issues is the floodplain. So basically, with the floodplains, we developed a publication called Considerations for Developing and Managing Macadamias on the Floodplains, because not all floodplain area is suitable for macadamias. What they've got to avoid is acid sulfate soils. They've got to avoid 1.5 metre Australian height datum, and they've got to avoid shallow soils because they need that 600 mil mound to put their plants on. So basically, we ran that publication, then Richmond, Ballina, Lismore and Clarence councils got together with us and they said, can we have input into this as well? So we did a second edition. So that's, if you go to the web now, that's the combined version with all the councils' input. A lot of growers obviously don't read that, which is unfortunate. But there is opportunities where they are below that AHD, where our fisheries guys are pushing blue carbon projects with mangroves and allowing the water to come back in. Creating mangroves, and but basically a social license issue again and better environmental outcomes. We go to the next slide, please. So it's education. I mean, urban dwellers, do they want to compromise what they've got? They're big income generators, as Kevin said, in the Northern Rivers for agriculture. Coffs Harbour in particular with the blueberries, should that totally disappear, the employment that's going through blueberries and harvesting and in employment on farm, it's quite huge, and the knock-on effects for that and your multi-reply effects for losing an agricultural industry is quite big. So we might go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I guess what we're really trying to push is the importance of education, and I guess this day is all about educating councillors. We need to educate the public. We also got to educate the growers. So yeah, that's pretty much me. Thanks, Mick. Milo, sorry.
Too good. Thanks, Jeremy.
Was that 10 minutes? I had to rush it, guys, because last time it was 20 something minutes. So
he knows how to talk, Jeremy. So great. Any questions? We'll get to them now. And in the meantime, we'll put a poll up about some of the issues you might have experienced for horticulture in your region. I think the first question, which we might pluck out towards Andrew, I think, and the complaints he's experienced is, how has council responded to that in the past, and what sort of considerations would you recommend councils take into account? This might echo some of the things Jeremy's just said, but.
Sorry, you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, if you will, Andrew, just from a grower's perspective.
Yeah, I guess from a grower perspective, the challenge, particularly with, well, we've just got a farm at the moment. It's just had a new 5-acre dwelling put on it. The council have insisted they put in some barriers there through extra tree plantings to try and buffer that house. So that's a really good thing. The problem will be when they sell up and the next neighbours move in, and if they've got a conflict of with what we're doing, we have to start again. And we talked about one the other day, just an opposite scenario of if you're a cattle farmer and you want to then do intensive agriculture and you put in a dehusking facility on your farm, all of a sudden you're changing the scope of your farming operation, and then you're going to create a different environment for all your neighbours. And how do you do that when technically you got that right to farm, whether you're transitioning from cattle to horticulture? So the challenge is in and around that, because I think one of the questions someone raised was the neighbour there first? That affects our right to farm. So extremely challenging. Certainly the sprays. We have to spray. If we don't get a crop. And the value of what the income I get and what I spend in the local economy is huge. And when you collectively add all the other groups together, like the communities are relying on that the spending of the money within the community. We've just got to re-educate every new neighbour. I've got a neighbour, he whinges every time I spray because it affects him and his wife's sunset watching position. I had a neighbour whinge about his bees at a certain time of year. They were there was too many bees around his house. So he told me that I needed to relocate my bees. And I just said, well, you prove they're my bees and I'll move them. You need the bees in the orchard at certain times a year. You just get some uneducated neighbours, but from council's perspective, it's just that right to farm. It's that education process.
Yeah.
In
absolutely.
my experience, we get EPA called out. So I go out to the grower,
Oh, we've lost you, Jeremy, I'm afraid. Oh, we'll move on and we'll come back to Jeremy with that point too about the EPA. Do you want to chuck that poll up, Helen, if you got it?
Yeah, so just sharing the results there, and as it's been indicated by Andrew, Kevin and Jeremy today, that land use conflict and urbanisation has really been the key thing that people feel has impacted the hort industry, and limitation of available or affordable land due to that urban sort of sprawl. So thanks everybody for participating in the polls today.
Noticed that come through in the comments too, so we really appreciate any and all ideas people have from their different contexts. While we got you to Andrew, we might just have a quick final question around initiatives for biodiversity, since that was coming up in the comments a lot too. Yeah,
look, Jeremy touched on good farming practices, and there's integrated orchard management and integrated pest management, and we do all that. We prune our trees so that we get light into the orchard, we get good grass cover. When we do get heavy rainfalls, we go out and there's water diverting down these grass drains. We engage pest monitors that come in, and they will tell us where the pest pressures are, what they are, where to spray, the timing of the sprays, the softer chemicals to use. So we do all that. We have mohawks down the centre of the rows to encourage beneficial insects. We have around the perimeter of the property, we've got a lot of natives, grevilleas and clystemons, and because they're flowering roughly the same time. So we build up all these beneficial insects in those settings. Through the centre of the farm here, we've got a lot of native trees through there, so that we try and introduce that biodiversity through the orchard. It's really important to do. If we didn't do all that, we'd have a lot more problems than what we do. So every time we spray, we have portable anemometers, we hold them up, we record everything just to cover our backside in case one of the neighbours has an issue. So we're very precise in what we do. As I said, we put out all our manures out sort of 4 months before we harvest, so that we don't have any issues with salmonella in the nuts when we deliver to the factory. So
great little rundown. And with that, we might have to leave it there. Any other questions, we'll do a roundup from our presenters later and try to get some info out to you the next week. So thank you very much for attending. We really enjoy running these sessions. We often end up learning a lot ourselves from our colleagues in DPI and in industry. We have an important announcement again before you go. Well, we've announced it previously in some of our earlier comms, but we're going to be hosting our 4th forum of our main paddock to planting program on Thursday, the 9th of November. We're going to be sending out an invite for that shortly. And the topic of this one's going to be data collection and consultation for developing rural land strategies. We've got some really good speakers lined up for that. And we're going to be reintroducing the breakout room discussions for council staff, especially you who want to discuss those topics among each other. So that's going to be very exciting. Look out for that. And finally, as you leave the session, you're going to be prompted to fill out a short participant survey for the webinar. It's not just the smiley face you get as you leave IKEA or wherever, I don't know. This feedback's actually really important to us. It's quick, but very important to us, just so we can keep the sessions going and tailor them better to your interests. So once again, thank you and hope to see you next time.